What I want to talk now about are what are the things that every teacher needs to be able to learn if they are going to be able to teach in these diverse schools. There's substantial agreement among the educational community on the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that these teachers need to have. In fact, if you look at Florida's own consent decree and the areas in which the state has mandated in-service education and which has affected the kind of pre-service programs that are provided, or also if you look at California and what's called their CLAD and B-CLAD certifications, you'll have a common sense, a commonality of what it is that nearly all of us agree we all need to know. And what are those areas? The first is first and second language acquisition and development. Clearly, we need to know something about what is normal and natural language development in the first language. What can we expect in the second language? We can't even begin to understand whether a child needs any kind of special education until we have a sense of what natural and normal development is. Secondly, cross-cultural communication. And critically here, not just understanding the different cultural traditions and values and expectations that children and adults bring to the classroom, but also an understanding of that home life, of the community, and not only understanding it, but actually interacting with it. Third, strategies for adapting instruction and adapting materials, and we'll talk in detail about this. And then fourth, appropriate assessment strategies. So we're talking about first and second language acquisition, cross-cultural communication, instructional modifications, and assessment modifications. Now let's look at each of these in a bit of detail. The relationship between first and second language acquisition and its effects on academic achievement. I've talked earlier about the importance of bilingual education as a way of supporting the first language while the second is being developed. There's a good reason for this. A man by the name of Jim Cummins has talked a lot about what's called a linguistic interdependence hypothesis. And it's, again, this is terminology for what I think most of us would understand as being expected, but it's nice to know that we also have a theoretical frame for this. What Cummins suggests is that anything that you've learned in your first language is available to you in your second language if you have the vocabulary and the language proficiency to be able to deal with it. You only need to learn to read once. Granted, you might have to learn to read from right to left versus left to right, depending upon which language. Or you might need to be able to read a system which is character-based, or if you've gone from character-based to alphabetic. But once you understand, once you have broken through to the understanding that there is a relationship between spoken language and print, you have already mastered an enormous skill. Once you know how to do division of fractions, you don't have to learn it again. What you might have to be able to do is talk about it in another language. But once you know how to do it, that information is available to you. So there's a kind of common core of understanding from which then we use languages to be able to talk about and also to increase our knowledge. The better educated a student is in his first language or her first language before coming into our classrooms, the greater the likelihood of transfer. And I think any of you have had students who have had superb educations in their home countries, you find that their transition into our classrooms, even if they have limited prior English, is really quite smooth. In fact, one of the things that we often do when we work with school districts, those of us who are in this field, is talk about if you have a child who comes from a country in such as many of the Asian countries where mathematics tends to be much accelerated over our introduction of concepts. So children in 6th and 7th grade are doing what many of our children are not doing until 8th grade. By all means, put them in their grade level math class because they're going to learn English through the mathematics. They already know the math concepts. And what this is going to do is enable them to transfer that information to English. Ideally, as I've indicated, schools should provide some of a child's academic program through the first language, but if they cannot, then it's really critical that teachers know how to access students' prior knowledge and experiences as they're learning the second language. Teachers need to understand language learning, language acquisition, and need to help students use all of their languages and their knowledge as resources. In terms of cross-cultural communication and interaction, it's really critical that we not only understand the world from which our students come, the families and the communities and the traditions and the values, but also that we can connect schooling with students' prior experiences, both educational, informal education, as well as informal in the home and the community. U.S. classrooms traditionally allow and encourage much more interaction and independence than most other schools around the world. It's difficult for students who have learned to memorize, never to question a teacher, and to work quietly to function in a U.S. classroom in which they are expected to speak out, ask questions, and to work with their peers. Teachers need to understand that there are a range of educational expectations, that teacher roles differ in different contexts, that student roles differ, and we need to be able to help teachers who go out into our schools to help students make the transition. I'm not suggesting that we should spend the rest of our time accommodating to other educational patterns or expectations, but we have to understand them if we're going to help students make that transition. In addition, we know that children come to school with multiple ways of learning, multiple learning style preferences. Again, Gardner's multiple intelligences applies here. This is not to suggest that they don't have to learn other ways. Clearly, visual learners have to learn how to be an oral learner in some cases. People who are kinesthetic have to learn how to sit still. People who like to work in groups have to also learn how to work on their own. Again, though, we need to understand that there is this range of experience and expectation and preference, and make sure that our teachers are able to design lessons that accommodate a variety of learning styles while helping students to transition or to be able to add on other learning styles. We also need to connect our schools with homes as much as possible. And here the work of Luis Moll has been really instrumental in changing my thinking, and I think the thinking of a lot of us teacher educators. What he has done is sent his teachers, his prospective teachers, out into the community to collect what he calls the funds of knowledge of the community. In other words, the cultural capital that children bring to school with them, the kinds of things that parents do at home, the kinds of experiences they have, the ways in which they use mathematics, the kind of science that's being used, in order that they can draw upon that, validate it, support it as they provide for new experiences. This is really critical if we're not going to do anything in the child's language, at least to validate the child's culture and experience. This is also critical in terms of classroom management. I've just written an article for ESL magazine on classroom management, which I suggest that we ought to even change the terms. What we're really talking about in today's schools is creating learning communities that are effective when you have this kind of diversity. Teachers need to learn, prospective teachers need to learn routines. They need to understand how to give directions quickly, how to get things done in a classroom smoothly. They need to be able to manage, to do transitions. But even more critical, they need to be able to bring the diversity of experiences into that classroom to be able to support that diversity as they're helping students really move into a new culture of schooling. There's a lot of very interesting work that's been done in this regard that I'm sure many of you know. The Kamehameha Project, for example, in Hawaii, which all of a sudden found out that one of the reasons that Hawaiian kids were having trouble in school was because they were being taught a whole set of routines that they didn't need to be taught. These kids were much more responsible than most kids who come to school. They already had taken on a great deal of responsibility at home. They went home. They had certain chores that they automatically did. They didn't need to be told to do it. In fact, as soon as teachers let go, the kids began organizing. They would, upon coming in, sweep, get out the materials for the day, make sure that any stragglers were coming in to the class were told to do so at the right time. In other words, the teacher didn't need to do these things because the kids already did it. And in these classes where you have some children who were not Hawaiian, it was interesting to see how they rapidly adapted to that particular environment. The third area that we need to spend some time on is on strategies for integrating language and content instruction, for adapting instruction, adapting materials, and particularly including technology in the mix to enable English language learners to study academic content while also acquiring that language. There are a number of strategies that have been found to be useful, but what I like to do when I work with teachers, and I do this around the world, I work with content area teachers and university faculty in many countries as well as our own, I like to talk about thinking about what makes academic texts and academic instruction complex, and they're really kind of two continua, and this is again drawn from Jim Cummins' work. Something is hard the degree to which you have to rely upon the language of the text or of the person's statement to understand it. So if you don't have any other source of information, you don't have any pictures, you don't have any graphs, you don't have any videos, you don't have any prior experience, there's nobody there who's helping you to understand, you're relying upon the language, the degree then of context. So the less the context, the harder it is, and so, or contextual support. The other continua is the degree of cognitive complexity of the ideas. Some things are just harder than others. And so the harder something is, the more it's going to be required of the teacher to break it down into chunks, into usable, understandable chunks. So the worst case scenario is something which has almost no context and in which all of the information is being conveyed through language, and secondarily, the ideas are hard. All right, I would suggest to you that lots of mathematics, when it's not made experiential, or science when it's not made experiential, or even social studies when concepts like freedom or dignity or honesty or any of those terms are not clearly exemplified, that's complex. When we have these, by the way, are hard for everybody. They're not hard just for English language learners. They're hard for all students. They're hard for all of us. But clearly, if you're also learning the language at the same time, that simply makes it more complex. Keeping these two continue in mind, let's then look at some of the strategies that teachers can use to help English language learners. And actually, what I think you're going to say when we finish talking about these is these are strategies that are good for all students because they're really good teaching. But what's nice to know is those strategies that help all students are particularly effective for students who are trying to learn the language of instruction. The first, let's talk about ways to increase the possible sources of information, which reduces the reliance on written or spoken language. In other words, the ways of increasing the context or the embeddedness or the support for students so that they don't just have a textbook and or a lecture or a discussion in which language is conveying all the information. I'm sure you do lots of these things, and I'm sure your teachers do. One is using pictures or using gestures or using any kind of visuals to provide support and to make concrete things that are otherwise abstract. That's one of the reasons we use tables and we use graphs, when even in our academic papers, is to be able to take and make something concrete. To involve students in demonstrations, experiential learning, where they no longer have to always rely upon a text or rely upon language. In fact, one of the things I'm going to suggest when we talk about assessment is one of the ways you can know if somebody understands something is not just what they tell you, it's what they show you. If they can do something in the language, then it doesn't, maybe not necessary for you to worry about the fact that there are some problems in the grammar or the vocabulary. Clearly, an ESOL teacher is going to work on that, and clearly over time that will improve. Not suggesting we should ignore it, but if you're trying to determine if a student understands something, let them show you, and let them also learn through experiential or hands-on demonstrations. Third, by developing instruction around a context, a common context or theme, as we've talked about thematic instruction, that tends to relate ideas clearly and also that integrates them with students' prior experiences, again, making it more concrete. Involving students in project work, which enables them to bring out the full extent of their abilities or the intelligences. And these projects shouldn't just involve written or oral language, although, of course, they're going to involve that. In fact, part of what will be wonderful is as students work together on projects, they will be negotiating meaning in English. And this is where they'll actually figure out whether or not they're understood, whether they need to modify how they're saying things. As they write things, they'll get feedback from each other as well as from you as a teacher or a teacher educator. And they'll understand not only the context but also be developing language. And then clearly using multiple grouping strategies to promote cooperative learning, peer tutoring, a variety of learner-centered approaches. I think we forget sometimes that students are often the best teachers for other students. And clearly, a language minority student, a student who's still learning English, may be better understood by one of his or her peers, and especially by a former English language learner. In some of the projects that I've been involved in, what we've done is we've paired sixth graders, for example, who are already pretty proficient in English with first graders who are just beginning to understand or beginning to acquire and learn English. They've been reading buddies, they've done after-school tutoring. At the high schools, the same thing works with a high school student who helps a middle school student with mathematics or science. This notion of cross-age tutoring, of peer tutoring, of working together helps provide students with other sources of support, having them rely less on a textbook or on a particular oral or written text.